workshop, and this week we are going to the Gospel of Luke. Actually, next week we are going right back to the Gospel of Luke as well. You can see the lesson that comes after this. Actually, the lessons in line for the next 3 weeks have us solely in the Gospel of Luke to round out this particular unit. So, if you're vaguely familiar with the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4 probably stands out a bit more renownedly for the fact this is the moment where Jesus enters into his hometown of Nazareth, sort of somewhere on the spectrum of assembling all of the disciples, the ones that we refer to as the disciples, later to become apostles. Of course, he's been gathering followers as this time has been transpiring from the beginning of Luke's gospel, starting with the birth narrative, working through the baptism of Jesus and taking the unique approach of giving us this little synopsis of Jesus in his hometown, preaching in the synagogue of Nazareth before he's ousted and threatened with death because of the claims that he is making from this particular spot. Now, just to bring up the passage again, we are starting in verse 16 and we're reading nearly a total of 17 verses, and so there's quite a bit more than I'll be focusing on here tonight, but I just want to draw our attention to the beginning of Jesus's, perhaps we can call it a sermon or a lesson, his commentary on what it is that he is reading as he was asked to stand up and read. And he specifically requested the scroll of Isaiah, and he rolled the scroll open to the place that we refer to as Isaiah 61, where he begins reciting this: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." One quick note, just in case you're not aware of this. This comes directly from Isaiah chapter 61, the first 4 verses. It's imperative that we as teachers are at least aware of this, whether we make our students aware of it or not, that the version of this that Jesus is citing from, or at least what Luke is recording as Jesus citing, is from the Septuagint, and that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament Scriptures. And there's 2 particular phrases, that being recovery of sight to the blind and to set free the oppressed, that in the actual Hebrew text, or at least as far back as we can trace the manuscript traditions of the oldest and most reliable Hebrew manuscripts, actually do not say those particular phrases. And I would encourage you to go back to Isaiah 61, read those verses yourself as a cross-reference, and with that you'll understand the significance of that. And I'm going to try to help connect the dots to that here as we go along, if we have time. But just looking at the opening phrase here, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." Now, when we get to Isaiah 61, obviously we are very deep into Isaiah's scroll at this point. There's only 5 chapters left to go before we roll it up. And of course, this is rather late, as goes the development of Isaiah's oracles. And what some refer to as second Isaiah, it's possible that the prophet himself may not even have actually said these things. It's possible this tradition comes from his disciples after the exile was over with and they are restored back to the land, but still looking forward to the Messianic era, which has not arrived by the time Cyrus gives the edict for them to leave the land of Babylon and go back to their ancestral homelands. Or, of course, the more accepted and traditional view that Isaiah is responsible for the totality of all that is encompassed in his scroll. We're not here to discuss that. But when we get to Isaiah 61, there is quite a bit of theology that has been firmly laid down and hyperlinked into various other parts of the scroll that come earlier, and of course to other parts of the Tanakh, or Hebrew Old Testament, that we really don't have time to explain all that's going on here in Isaiah 61. We'll just have to kind of take some of it for granted. But I did try to recite a few verses for you here in these blue boxes on the screen, that when Isaiah, before Jesus recites this, when Isaiah begins this particular oracle with "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," the first question that we should be asking ourselves in reading just Isaiah's text is, who exactly is the prophet talking about? Is he talking about himself? Because certainly it has become the prophetic tradition at this point, stemming all the way back to Moses, that the Spirit of the Lord is resting upon and anointing his prophet, who has the unique ability to be invited into the divine council chambers of the Lord and to, as Micaiah standing before Jehoshaphat and Ahab, as they are taking counsel with Ahab's prophets, and Jehoshaphat is requesting an audience with the prophet who actually listens to Yahweh. And Micaiah says that he had the chance to peer into that particular session where the Lord was taking counsel amongst his holy ones, and the question was who was going to go forth and entice Ahab to enter into battle with the king of Aram, because this was ultimately going to lead to the Lord bringing his judgment upon Ahab, as was already promised before through the mouth of Elijah sometime before that particular moment. Point being is that this tradition of the Spirit resting upon a particular person and having this gift of charismatic utterance, so forth, in revealing God's truth and speaking it authoritatively to God's people is firmly something that Isaiah is established in as a prophet. But by the time we get to Isaiah 61, there have been several particular passages that should be known to us in which we clearly see there is also another tradition that's forming within the Isaiah scroll itself, and that is the one who is endowed with the Spirit and charged with this specific messianic mission that starts in Isaiah 11. A shoot growing up from the stump of Jesse, meaning he's going to be a new David, so speaking directly of the Messiah with respect to that, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. So he is the one who is the Spirit bearer. And then when we get to Isaiah 42, this is my servant, I've strengthened him, this is my chosen one, I delight in him, and I've put my Spirit on him. And then as you continue to unpack that passage, we understand Messiah is not just the Spirit bearer, he's also the Spirit bringer with respect to what his role is going to be in rescuing Israel and reconciling them back to God, and not just them, but the nations as well. Or Isaiah 48, and of course that will bridge on into Isaiah 49, and there are several other passages we could cite. But Isaiah 48, approach me and listen to this. From the beginning I have not spoken in secret. From the time anything existed, I was there. The I, the first person pronoun here, is speaking of the servant of the Lord, the true servant. In the passages from Isaiah 40 through 48, there are three particular characters who are mentioned as the Lord's servant. The first being this rather enigmatic conquering king introduced in Isaiah 41, who later in Isaiah 44 and 45 we understand is identified as Cyrus, the pagan Persian emperor who God is going to use as his anointed one, his Mashiach or Messiah figure, who is going to be the one to allow Israel to leave captivity, go back to their land, have the chance to rebuild city and temple using the funds that he will provide them. And of course, it was thought this was supposed to be a Davidic role up to this point, but now it's Cyrus, a plan that God had kind of been holding very close to the chest and is now unveiling it right at a pivotal point toward the end of Israel's exile and captivity to make it known to them that no other idol had done this. This was solely a plan of God's doing. That being said, when we move through the rest of those chapters, we also come to understand very shortly after that, we get another servant introduced into the mix, and that is the corporate nation of Israel, or the ethnic descendants of Abraham, who are actually called away, locked up in captivity in Babylon at that time. And they have been the Lord's servant since their inception as a nation, birthed out of the womb of Egypt, and now, of course, coming to the Lord at Sinai to be wed unto him in covenant matrimony, and receive that commission of being a kingdom of priests and, of course, the conduit by which he's going to reconcile the nations. They have failed in that mission, but God is still going to utilize them as a servant of sorts and a faithful witness to the nations of how God, in his loving mercy and kindness, has restored a rebellious and treacherous people that he made his own and yet walked away from him. But still, God is using them to show the nations the true testimony of what his love and grace looks like and what it's all about, and what he intends to do for the nations who long before Israel had also walked away from the Lord at Babel. Then we get the introduction of the third servant character, who is the servant of, or the subject of Isaiah 42 and then 49 through 55, in what is often called the servant songs. So again, he is the Spirit bearer, he is the Spirit bringer. And so for Jesus to be using this particular phrase of himself in Isaiah 61 is to activate not only Isaiah 61, but what Isaiah 61 is continuous with. And that again is Isaiah 42, 49 through 55. As we see in the rest of the Isaiah 61 passage, this is purely messianic. And if that's the case, then we're activating that entire bundle of prophecies. But I would just dial it down a bit more microscopically for us to recognize as teachers, we need to help our students also see the proper hermeneutical tactic is that we're not just taking the 4 verses that Jesus is reading here and saying this is all that he is activating of the Isaiah prophecy. That is not how the Jews in synagogue that day would have understood this. They don't interpret the Bible in chunks like that. If Jesus is about to say in a very scandalous way, in your own hearing, this very day, these words are fulfilled, they understand that all of this is coming right now if Jesus is Messiah, and they accept that fact. All right, so we've covered at least the fact the Spirit of the Lord is upon Jesus, what that means, the significance coming from Isaiah's perspective, the fact that he has been anointed, but then to do what? To preach. Of course, this assigns a prophetic role to the servant of the Lord to proclaim good news to the poor. Before we get to the poor, let's speak about what exactly it means for him to be preaching, because we go from Isaiah 48 in the last blue box now into this orange box at the bottom of the screen, where the servant has now been introduced back onto the stage. He's been somewhat dormant for most of 43 through 48. He was first mentioned in 42, and then the shift, or the frame of reference shifts in perspective away from the servant back to Yahweh as first person, speaking to the audience of Israel and the nations brought together in that kind of courtroom deposition scene. Now the servant is the one stepping up to take center stage. And this is what he says: coasts and islands, listen to me, distant peoples, pay attention. The Lord called me before I was born, or before he was branded as the Lord's servant in his mother's womb. He named me while I was in my mother's womb. He made my words like a sharp sword, and he hid me in the shadow of his hand. He made me like a sharpened arrow, and he hid me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. So just to speak very quickly about what the idea here is with respect to the word picture. It's not to say this plan has been hidden for all time up until this particular moment where the servant is unveiling what God's plan is by use of the imagery of the sword or the arrow being hidden in his hand or in the quiver. The idea, though, is that it's concealed for the sake of unveiling it at just the right moment. When the time has come, it's most strategically advantageous to the person wielding the sword or the arrow to strike, so the enemy or target cannot see it. And again, all of this commotion-wise happening in Isaiah's oracles right at the end of the Babylonian exile, when they're about to be released to go back to the land. But of course, it's going to be 5 centuries before this servant figure actually shows up. So the Lord is going to continue to conceal this. He has winked at what exactly his plan is, but as far as the particular details of how it's going to actually come to pass is not being unveiled until this moment, when Jesus, in his hometown synagogue that he has been in for 30 years up to this point, from infancy up until this moment where he begins his ministry, they did not realize who was sitting amongst them, and now he is making it clear all of this is coming to pass. God is drawing back the curtain and showing the full prize of what lay beneath it. All right, so to preach to the poor, here we would bridge over to Psalm 37, because the actual word there in Hebrew is literally translated humble. It's not so much to connote the idea of people who lack money, but more so those who have been humiliated or those who have a more natural predisposition to being humble. We get this from Psalm 37 that uses the same Hebrew word. The humble will inherit the land and will enjoy abundant prosperity, which is the very verse that's influencing what Jesus is saying as he opens up the Beatitudes in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth. So it's a proclamation to those who are humble. And this, of course, speaks to the posture of heart of those who are willing to accept what the Lord's plan is. Again, if we go back to the Isaiah corpus and we recognize what's going on there, Isaiah 61 predicated upon the big dialogue that's been going on between God and Israel from chapter 40 through 48, where God has unveiled this plan of how he is going to initiate this new Exodus phase first with a servant or Messiah figure that's actually a pagan, and the emperor who controls everything aspect-wise about their life. Of course, this is an incredibly scandalous thing to them. They have a very difficult time accepting this. When we go deep into that dialogue around chapters 46 and a little bit beyond that, we have the Lord addressing Israel and asking, why do you say, as though you are the clay to the potter, what are you making? Or the child to the father, what are you fathering? Or to the mother, what are you giving birth to? All of this to call into question God's specific plan that's going to start not with a Davidic descendant who is going to be some sort of conquering militaristic figure who is going to just completely lay waste and decimate Babylon, even though Isaiah in Isaiah 17, and I believe chapter 13 had already dispelled that Babylon will fall, and that will come almost within a day. And it will become the haunt of jackals and ostriches. It will become the subject of God's complete, utter, total ruining wrath, almost like a new Sodom and a new Gomorrah of sorts. And so they're not exactly sure how that plan's going to unfold, but they assume, because of prophecies like what they have in Isaiah 7, Isaiah 9, and Isaiah 11, that it's going to be this Davidic descendant that's been talked about. But for then to God to reveal it's going to be Cyrus instead, the Persian emperor who will defeat the Babylonians, it's almost too much to bear, because how could someone have such a gloriful triumph that's been orchestrated by the Lord, who will in no way, shape, or form pay homage to the Lord in an actual sincere and humble way? Cyrus does, in a sense, attribute what he has done in overcoming Babylon and all the lands and kingdoms that they ruled to the God of Israel, but he only does that in the vein of also attributing it to the very gods of the other peoples that he also sets free, and chiefly to the god Marduk, who is the chief of the pantheon of the Babylonians. All that to simply say that Israel's having a very tough time in this dialogue with God in Isaiah 40 through 48, taking in what it is that God has said and what he intends to do. So when we get to Isaiah 61 and we have the Spirit bearer and the Spirit bringer, yet again stepping into this role, identifying the fact the Spirit of the Lord is upon him, he has anointed him to proclaim the good news to the humble. The humble would be those who are willing to accept this, what God's actual agenda and plan is, and move forward with it. By this point in Isaiah, there has been a long-standing dichotomization of true Israel from ethnic Israel or false Israel. Because, of course, some ethnic members of Israel can be part of the true Israel, but the true Israel consists of those Jewish people descended from Abraham who are accepting what God's messianic plan is, and that agenda moving forward, starting initially with this phase of Cyrus, and then, of course, culminating in the true servant, who Cyrus mimics, but is the subject of Isaiah 42, 49 through 55. And, of course, they're going to be the ones who are willing to walk shoulder to shoulder with the Gentiles, because the nations are going to be invited into this plan to become a part of God's new covenant people, whereas those who are maybe ethnically descended from Israel but want nothing to do with this and somehow presume that God's plan is not what the prophet is projecting, or that God might change his mind and go a different route, or for whatever reason they do not want anything to do with this plan that involves Cyrus as the initial step of it, they become the false Israel, who eventually will find themselves outside of the heavenly city, the New Jerusalem that represents the new creation, the new cosmos, in Isaiah 65 and 66. All right, so he has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, and it's in here we need to understand what proclaim release means. Taking the context from Leviticus 25, this gives us the concept of the year of Jubilee, which this is the only place in Scripture where it's actually ever talked about. It's never recorded for us that they ever observed the year of Jubilee at some point in Israel's past. It's very possible they may have, just because it's not recorded. All that does is create an argument of silence for us, which is always weak at best. But that being said, because we have no recorded observance of it, it seems to bear out all the more significance if they never brought this to pass. And we seem to have some good evidence within Scripture to back up the notion that it was never never fully observed, if ever observed, because we have mentions of particular Passovers that were very prolific in the day they were celebrated. And the person who remembers that for us in Scripture, writing that down, says something to the effect of, and no Passover had been celebrated like this since the days of Samuel or Joshua. And so there seems to be enough recorded information with respect to those Passovers that stretch back hundreds of years and the time gap that they give to make a statement to this effect that this Passover rivaled anything that came before it. One would think then, if they had ever celebrated the year of Jubilee, which requires 3 years of letting the land lay completely fallow and not planting anything, all debts are completely canceled, all slaves are set free, and not just simply cut loose. They are also given trinkets, tokens, expensive baubles, changes of clothes, all that stuff from their masters. It's like a miniaturized exodus out of Egypt of sorts, in which they are given all these possessions to then go and start a new life so that they never have to sell themselves into slavery again, potentially. So it's a big loss to those people who are having to give up these servants, cancel debts. They're not going to get any of that money back. Let land that they have been growing crops on for maybe a couple of generations now, since the last year of Jubilee, go back to the people who originally possessed it but had to sell it for whatever reason. All that to say, it's a reset point for the land, and it starts on the Day of Atonement of the 49th year. So with that in mind, or at the end of the 49th year that starts the 50th year, with that in mind, it's a not only physical reset, a material reset, it's a spiritual reset for the entire land. So the significance of this, and what is the spiritual motif that's the greater reality, is the idea that these people are experiencing a brand new exodus of sorts, and Jesus, activating this passage from Isaiah 61, is saying this time of exodus has come. But it's more than just kicking Rome out and giving you your land back if you actually can prove who it was that owned this some generations ago, back to the time of the captivity or what have you. The idea of the spiritual or the physical motif giving way to the actual true spiritual reality is for these people to be let loose of the greatest captor and oppressor that they are kept under, and of course that is sin. I have another reference here from Jeremiah 34 to show you just kind of how this is utilized, because the idea of proclaiming freedom in Leviticus 25 is also something that was supposed to happen in the time when Judah was under attack by the Babylonians, and Zedekiah had made a covenant with the people that they were supposed to let their slaves go free, but then he reneged on that. But again, just to signify what the idea of releasing captives was really about. All right. Recovery of sight to the blind. This is a Septuagintal, interpretive, messianic adding. What I mean by that is, as I had referenced at the beginning, this is not something that's in the most reliable and oldest Hebrew manuscripts, but this is something that was interpreted differently when the translators who went from the Hebrew to the Greek text, again noted as the Septuagint, decided to change for the sake of perhaps, your guess is as good as anyone's, why they chose to interpret it this way, maybe connecting it back to Isaiah 35, and the idea that in Isaiah 35, one of the messianic signs that should accompany the arrival of that age is that the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the lame will leap like deer. And so at the time when these texts are moving from Hebrew into the Greek, a messianic tradition no doubt had started to form and created the idea that if Messiah is the one who is going to fulfill the concept of what's being mentioned here in Isaiah 61, this is something he will bring to pass. But of course, in a more spiritualized way, what we understand is not only is the reality of receiving sight for those who are blind something that would accompany the arrival of Messiah, but in a more transcendental way, what happens to those generations after Messiah leaves and people aren't receiving sight anymore who were blind? Is it possible that they may still suffer from a sort of blindness that's even more severe than the loss of or the never attaining to real physical sight? Of course, spiritual blindness. And that is the theme that Jesus is driving home in John 9 when he does the feat that no one has ever done or ever heard of, a man being born blind, having his sight given back to him. And the idea behind it is to draw out the dichotomy between those who say they can see but are spiritually blind to their own sin versus those who recognize their sin and they see that it's ever before them. And because of that, even though they could be physically blind, they understand and grasp the truth better than those who were the most learned of their people. to set free the oppressed. Again, this is another Septuagintal line. The Hebrew reads, to give liberty to the prisoners. Even if we were to read it in the Hebrew here, the idea is, number one, in Isaiah's day, prophesying what Messiah would do is not to say he is going to go into the depths of Babylon and throw open their prisons and bring out the Israelites who are held captive there. There probably were some brigands amongst the Hebrew exiles that were locked away in prisons in Babylon, but for the most part, the actual Babylonian captivity was a lot more cush than, say, the Egyptian slavery and exile there in that country. They were not treated as slaves, maybe looked down upon as inferior to native Babylonians, but obviously their living was comfortable enough that many of them chose to stay behind when the first wave of exiles began to return home in the days of Zerubbabel and Joshua. So as opposed to the entire nation of Israel leaving Egypt when Moses was bringing them out, these people did not want to leave behind their comforts for the sake of going back to a land that many of them had never truly known before. So, setting free the prisoners, again, is a physical motif that gives rise to a greater spiritual reality, and that being set free from the captivity or the oppression of their greatest enslaver, that being sin, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So I go here to Exodus chapter 28, which only has a connection here, as goes the use of the word or term Lord's favor, because this in Exodus 38, as we look back to, Exodus 28, the items of Aaron's sacred garments, that golden plate on the top of his turban crown, and it says here that he is supposed to bear the sins of the Israelites or the guilt connected with their holy offerings. In the last sentence, it's always to be on his forehead so that they, the community of Israel, may find acceptance with the Lord. So the Hebrew word there, acceptance, coming from the root ratzah, is the exact same Hebrew word that would be translated favor in Isaiah 61, the host passage from which Jesus is translating from. So in other words, this is something of a priestly function, but more so the idea of if Aaron is the conduit, and any high priest that follows on after him, the conduit by which these people represented in him, through him, by him, are going to find acceptance before the Lord. If he does his role perfectly, then the idea is that the person who is the Spirit bearer and the Spirit bringer that fulfills Isaiah 61 is going to do the same thing, that he is coming to proclaim this good news, and by virtue of that, he is going to activate the functions that in the oppressiveness, in the blindness that has befallen these people, and ultimately to say to everyone involved, they have found acceptance with the Lord. So the time of their guilt-bearing has come to an end. So there's a lot here that's going on, and we haven't even begun to really even touch the surface, much less scratch it. But I will reference these two black boxes at the bottom, because if you're familiar with this story or not, reading beyond it, you'll see what the reaction of this group of people who have known Jesus since boyhood is when he says these things are fulfilled in their ears. And of course, when he goes on to give some examples of how he is going to deal with his people and the reaction they will have, as goes hardening of heart, because he will refer back to the days of both Elijah and Elisha, the widow that Elijah helped, the leper that Elisha cleansed. And by virtue of that, this is going to be much in the same way how God is going to visit his favor upon the nations, represented by the widow and the leper, who were both Gentiles, and the opposition that's going to be had by virtue of the hardness of heart and the stubbornness that the Israelites will meet Messiah's message with, which is expected. Isaiah chapter 8, this is what is said of the Lord. He will be a sanctuary, but for the two houses of Israel, he will be a stone to stumble over, and a rock to trip over, and a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Lord will reveal his message, but what will happen is, as he comes to serve as a sanctuary where they can come and meet with God, commune with God, instead, they will treat him as though he's a rock to trip over and stumble upon, because they will not accept his agenda or his message. And how much more when Isaiah opens up the oracle that is Isaiah 53, the gospel contained in the Old Testament, how the suffering servant will indeed reconcile God's people back to himself. He opens this up with a very grave question. Who will believe what this report entails? Because it's not only so outrageously outlandish that no one could really accept that God would actually have this in mind, as goes the means by which his people will be reconciled. But this becomes the reality of Israel in the day in which Jesus actually brings this reality to pass. Because many will still, even to this day, stumble over the idea that God's servant had to suffer and die before he would be glorified, or rather through that process, he would be glorified and bring about the reconciliation of not only God's covenant people, Israel, but the new covenant people, the Gentiles, with the nation of Israel as well. So anyway, it's a lot. And as always, time is working against us, and we never have enough time to go over it all. But if there are any questions, if not, well, as always, I appreciate your time.